spent 25 years building a life with a man I thought I knew. I knew his coffee order, his favorite shirt, and the way he breathed when he was dreaming. But sitting at that table, wearing a disguise that felt like a second skin, I realized I was a stranger at my own husband's birthday party. When she leaned over and whispered in his ear, I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, hollow clarity. Then she looked at me, the hired help sitting at the far end of the table, and she screamed. That was the moment the world stopped turning. That was Evelyn. She didn't go to that party to cause a scene. She went because the silence in her marriage had finally become loud enough to scream. She had been running from the truth for 2 years. This story exists because, eventually, the truth catches up, no matter how fast you run or how well you hide. This is a story about the cost of loyalty, the weight of a secret, and the moment a woman decides that being a good wife isn't worth losing her soul. The question is, when you find out your entire life was a beautiful lie, do you stay for the comfort, or do you burn it all down to finally breathe? Evelyn's marriage to Arthur did not end with a sudden explosion. It eroded, like a shoreline giving way to a persistent, rising tide. For 3 decades, she had been the architect of his domestic peace. The woman who ensured the silverware was polished and the children's schedules were seamless. She moved through their limestone mansion with a grace that masked her own gradual disappearance. Arthur was a man of industry, a billionaire whose presence commanded entire boardrooms. Yet in the quiet of their shared bedroom, he had become a ghost. He would sit on the edge of the bed, unfastening his gold watch and placing it on the nightstand with a heavy thud, never once turning to see the woman waiting for him in the shadows. He stopped asking her how her day was, and more importantly, he stopped listening when she tried to tell him. Evelyn began to notice small, sharp fractures. She found a receipt for a vintage pearl necklace in the pocket of a discarded suit jacket, yet her own jewelry box remained unchanged. She watched him through the kitchen window as he paced the garden, talking into a secondary phone he thought she didn't know existed. The house they shared grew larger and colder, a museum of high-end furniture where no one truly lived. Evelyn found herself spending hours in the conservatory, staring at a single dead leaf on a prize-winning orchid, wondering when she had lost the ability to feel the sun on her skin. She had become a master of self-delusion, telling herself that Arthur was simply tired, that the pressures of his empire were weighing him down. She would lay out his favorite silk tie on the dresser every morning, a small ritual of hope that he would notice the gesture and come back to her. He never did. He would grab the tie without looking, his eyes fixed on the screen of his tablet, and walk out the door before she could even say goodbye. She began to feel like a piece of the architecture, a reliable pillar that he assumed would always be there, requiring no maintenance and no affection. The emotional isolation was a heavy coat she wore every day, even in the height of summer. One rainy afternoon, while Arthur was supposedly in London for a merger, Evelyn found a printed invitation tucked inside a leather portfolio in his study. It was an invitation to a private 60th birthday gala at an exclusive estate in the countryside, his own birthday. The guest list was a catalog of the city's elite, but her name was nowhere to be found. Instead, the invitation listed the host as a woman named Elena, a name that tasted like copper in Evelyn's mouth. She stood in the center of the mahogany-paneled room, clutching the stiff card until the edges bit into her palms. She did not cry. Instead, she sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer, finding a set of keys to a townhouse she had never visited. The realization that she was being systematically erased from his public life was the final blow. She walked to the mirror and pulled her hair back tightly, realizing she no longer recognized the woman staring back at her. The plan was not born of a desire for revenge, but a desperate need for evidence. Evelyn knew she could not confront him with suspicions. He would simply use his power and his words to make her feel small and imaginative. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes. She contacted an old friend who owned a high-end catering firm and made an unusual request. She wanted to work the party, not as the guest of honor, but as a server. Her friend had hesitated, but seeing the steady, chilling resolve in Evelyn's eyes, he had agreed. Evelyn spent the following week practicing. She learned how to carry a heavy tray without trembling, how to keep her head down, and how to disappear into the background of a crowded room. She purchased a synthetic brunette wig that felt coarse against her scalp and a pair of plain, thick-rimmed glasses that obscured her most recognizable feature, her piercing, intelligent eyes. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The evening of the gala arrived with a heavy, gray sky. The estate was a sprawling glass and steel structure tucked into the hills, illuminated by thousands of fairy lights that looked like cold stars. Evelyn arrived in a cramped van with the rest of the catering staff, wearing a stiff black apron and sensible shoes that squeaked on the polished marble floors. She kept her head bowed as the manager barked orders, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved through the kitchen, a space filled with the smell of seared scallops and expensive champagne, feeling a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in 25 years, she was not the woman responsible for the guest list. She was a ghost in the machinery of Arthur's new world. The dining hall was a spectacle of opulence, with long tables draped in white silk and centerpieces of black lilies. Evelyn carried a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, weaving through the crowd of men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than a modest home. She saw Arthur standing by the fireplace, looking more relaxed than she had seen him in years. He was laughing, a sound she hadn't heard directed at her in a decade. Tucked under his arm was Elena, a woman in her late 20s with blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elena was wearing the pearl necklace Evelyn had found a receipt for. Evelyn felt a surge of nausea, but she forced herself to keep moving. She approached a group of guests, offering them smoked salmon with a steady hand, her eyes focused on the floor. She was so close she could smell Arthur's cologne, the woodsy scent she had bought for him last Christmas. As the dinner began, the catering manager assigned Evelyn to the head table. Her hands shook as she placed a water goblet in front of her husband. He didn't even glance at her. He was too busy leaning in toward Elena, his hand resting familiarly on the small of her back. The conversation at the table was a blur of stock prices and travel plans, but Evelyn heard every word of Elena's high, brittle laughter. She stood at the edge of the room with the other servers, her back against a cold stone pillar, watching the life she thought she owned being lived by someone else. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It was a physical weight in the room. She watched Arthur toast to his future, his eyes bright with an ambition that no longer included her. She felt a profound sense of mourning for the 25 years she had spent building a foundation for a man who had simply walked away and built a new house on top of it. The tension reached its breaking point when Elena decided she wanted a specific vintage of wine that was not currently on the table. She snapped her fingers, a sharp, disrespectful sound that echoed in Evelyn's ears. Evelyn took the bottle from the ice bucket and walked toward the head table. As she leaned over to pour the wine, Arthur made a joke, and the entire table erupted in laughter. In that moment of distraction, Evelyn didn't pull away. Instead, she took a seat in the empty chair directly across from Arthur. The movement was slow and deliberate. She set the wine bottle down with a heavy thud on the white silk cloth. The laughter died instantly. Arthur's face went from a jovial red to a sickly, pale gray as he looked up. He didn't recognize her at first through the wig and glasses, but as she reached up and slowly removed the spectacles, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. Elena, unaware of the identity of the server, was the first to break the silence. She stood up, her face twisted in a mask of indignation. She began to yell, her voice shrill and commanding, demanding to know what this servant thought she was doing at their table. She called for the manager, her finger pointing accusingly at Evelyn's face, her words filled with the entitlement of a woman who thought she had already won. She screamed about the ruined atmosphere and the incompetence of the staff, her voice rising until every guest in the room had turned to stare. Arthur remained frozen, his glass halfway to his mouth, his eyes locked on Evelyn's steady, unblinking gaze. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was not solid, but a thin sheet of ice that had just begun to crack. Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply watched the woman Arthur had chosen over her unravel in a fit of public rage. The manager rushed over, his face flushed with panic, reaching out to grab Evelyn's arm to escort her away. Evelyn didn't move. She reached up and pulled the synthetic wig from her head, her own silver blonde hair cascading down her shoulders. She placed the wig on the table next to the wine bottle. The manager stopped in his tracks, his mouth falling open. The room went so silent that the sound of the rain against the glass roof seemed to roar. Evelyn stood up, her posture perfect, the apron suddenly looking like a ceremonial robe. She looked at the guests, many of whom she had hosted in her own home, and then she looked at Arthur. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the set of keys she had found in his desk, dropping them onto his dinner plate. They landed with a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to signal the final end of their shared history. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. She didn't address the mistress's yelling or the affair. She simply looked at Arthur and said that she had spent 30 years making sure he never had to worry about the details of his life, and she was glad to see he had found someone else to manage the scenery. She then turned to Elena and told her that the pearl necklace looked better in the receipt than it did on her neck. With a slight, dignified nod to the room, Evelyn turned and walked toward the exit. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked past the rows of stunned faces, her sensible shoes clicking firmly on the marble. Behind her, the mistress began to yell again, but the sound was now hollow, the noise of someone who realized they were standing in the wreckage of someone else's life. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was a spectacle for the tabloids, but for Evelyn, it was a period of profound quiet. She moved into a small apartment with high ceilings and large windows that overlooked the park. She spent her mornings sitting on a wooden bench, watching the seasons change, and her evenings reading the books she had never had time for. She refused to participate in the public mudslinging. When Arthur's lawyers reached out with settlement offers that were insults to her 30 years of service, she didn't argue. She simply sat in her lawyer's office, her hands folded in her lap, and rejected them until they brought a number that reflected her true contribution to his empire. She wasn't fighting for the money. She was fighting for the recognition of her own worth. She realized that her silence had been her greatest mistake in the marriage, but it was now her greatest strength in the divorce. Arthur's life, meanwhile, began to fray at the edges. Without Evelyn to manage the invisible details of his existence, he became erratic. He missed appointments, his house was always in a state of disarray, and the mistress he had thought would bring him youth only brought him constant, exhausting drama. He realized too late that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the person who made his life possible. He began to call Evelyn late at night, his voice thick with regret and expensive scotch, begging her to come back and fix the mess he had made. Evelyn would listen to him for a moment, the sound of his breathing no longer a comfort, but a reminder of a life she had outgrown. She would wait for him to finish. Then she would quietly hang up the phone and return to the peace of her own room, where the only sound was the ticking of a small clock. The mistress eventually left him when the legal battles began to drain his liquid assets, and his reputation made him a liability in social circles. She was a creature of the sun, and Arthur was entering a long, cold winter. Evelyn watched the news of their split from a distance, feeling neither joy nor sorrow. She had learned the hard lesson of impermanence. She realized that the billionaire husband she had loved was a character she had helped create, and when she stopped playing her part, the character ceased to exist. She spent a lot of time in a local meditation center, learning how to sit with the emptiness that followed the betrayal. She found that once she stopped trying to fill the hole in her heart with someone else's approval, the hole began to close on its own. She was becoming a character in her own story for the very first time. Evelyn's children, who had initially been caught in the crossfire of their parents' separation, eventually found their way back to her. They saw a version of their mother they had never known, a woman who was not defined by her husband's bank account or his social standing. They would sit in her new kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air, and talk about things they had never discussed in the mansion. They talked about fear, about growth, and about the courage it takes to start over when you're supposed to be settling down. Evelyn realized that her betrayal had given her children a gift as well. The truth that a person's dignity is not something that can be taken away, only something that can be surrendered. She watched them leave her apartment with a sense of pride she had never felt as the billionaire's wife. Evelyn eventually sold the designer gowns and the heavy jewelry she had accumulated over the years, donating the proceeds to a charity that supported women transitioning out of abusive or controlling relationships. She kept only one thing, a small, silver locket that held a picture of herself as a young girl before she had met Arthur. She wore it every day as a reminder of the person she had been before she became a supporting actress in someone else's drama. She began to write a memoir, not about the billionaire or the betrayal, but about the slow process of rediscovering one's own voice in the silence. She sat at her small desk every morning, the sun hitting the page, and wrote until her hand ached. The story was no longer a tragedy. It was a manual for survival. Looking back on the night of the party, Evelyn realized it was the most honest moment of her marriage. For 30 seconds, the masks were off, and everyone in the room saw the reality of the situation. The mistress's yell had been the sound of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Evelyn understood that Arthur had not just betrayed her. He had betrayed himself, trading a lifetime of genuine partnership for a momentary reflection of his own vanity. She saw him now as a man who was desperately afraid of his own shadow, whereas she had learned to walk through the dark and find her own way out. The limestone mansion was eventually sold to a developer, and Evelyn didn't even feel a twinge of nostalgia when she saw the photos of the demolition in the newspaper. She went undercover not to catch a husband in an act of infidelity, but to catch herself in an act of disappearance. She needed to see what was left of Evelyn when the billionaire's wife was removed from the equation. What she found was a woman who was capable of standing alone in a room of 1,000 people and feeling perfectly at home. She realized that the most dangerous lie she had ever told was the one she told herself every morning, that she was happy in the shadows. The betrayal was simply the light that forced her to see the truth. She no longer read old messages looking for the moment she had missed. She was too busy writing new ones, building a life that was smaller in scale, but infinitely larger in meaning. This is the hard truth of the story. Loyalty is a virtue, but when it becomes a hiding place for fear, it becomes a cage. Evelyn had spent 25 years maintaining the bars of her own prison, thinking it was a palace. The mistress's scream was the sound of the door swinging open. Some people spend their entire lives sitting at tables where they aren't truly seen, waiting for a seat that will never be theirs. But the bravest thing a person can do is to realize that the table doesn't matter if the people sitting at it don't know who you are. Evelyn left the party a servant and walked into the night a queen of her own quiet empire. The question remains for all of us. Are you sitting at a table that requires you to wear a disguise? And if so, what would happen if you finally took it off?